Haere mai, and welcome to Cult Chat, the podcast where we talk about coercion, control, and all things cultish. I'm Dr. Caroline Ansley. I'm a medical doctor. As a child, I lived at the Centrepoint community, a notorious cult in New Zealand, and now I run a website that advocates for the former children of the community.
I'm Liz Gregory, and I run the Glory of Our Leavers Support Trust, and I'm privileged to walk alongside people after leaving this group as they embark on their new lives.
And I'm Lindy Jacob. I'm a former member of the Exclusive Brethren, and I'm part of the Olive Leaf Network, a new initiative in Aotearoa to support leavers of high-demand religious groups.
Come with us as we unpack the cult playbook. We'll be talking to experts and leavers of coercively controlling groups, and we will call for Kiwis to cult-proof their lives.
Come with us as we traverse the cultiverse.
A warning, this podcast contains references to subjects and discussions which may be difficult for some people to hear. Please take care of yourselves and your whānau when listening.
Hi everyone, and welcome to Cult Chat. Nice to see you here today, Kaz. Now,
Hello.
Lindy can't join us because, like us, she has been traipsing around the South Island having a little visit here and there. Now, you popped in on us, Kaz. Was that the highlight of your holiday?
Oh, well, there was actually quite a few chickens and ducks involved, which, as you know, is like not my, most excited place. Seeing you and your wonderful husband and some of your friends was definitely a highlight, but the chickens and ducks I just had to sort of tolerate, really.
Oh, nice. So Kaz popped in on a day that we were having a delivery, so Lindy, I'm sure she wished she was there. Look, we've got a really interesting episode, so we're going to launch into it quite quickly. We've got lots of networks and friends, and often people coming out of cults struggle to create new relationships, mainly because they have been shunned. And that's where we're heading today, because we're up to episode 3 in a 4-part series on shunning. So today I just want to let you know that we've got a very, very special episode where Lindy Jacob was interviewing Craig Hoyle, and he's a former Exclusive Brethren. And this interview took place at the Decult Conference. It was recorded, and we are going to be sharing portions of that today that relate to the conversation of shunning. And then we will be inviting you to join us for part 4, where we have a full sum up of his interview and also Wendy and Savine's contributions. So Craig is the author of a book, Excommunicated, and we have talked about this before. He is cousin of Lindy. And so let's go straight over to their recording now, where we will hear them and watch them for those on YouTube. Have a discussion around leaving the Brethren and the issues around shunning.
All right, let's launch into it, Liz. I'm looking forward to it.
Kia ora koutou, it's really good to have you all here. Yeah, we're really here to hear about Craig, and as it's been shared, this is not primarily a session about the Exclusive Brethren, rebranded as the Plymouth Brethren Christian Church. It's also really about the process of writing a memoir, and not just any memoir, but an intergenerational memoir that covers so many generations, 200 years of history, as it's also been acknowledged by some of the other former members. So many of us in these groups, especially if we're second generation or multi-generation, we're not adult recruits, so many of us, it's not just us, it's our entire family lineage that has kind of been is exploded by these groups. So yeah, Craig's book really details that, and that's that kind of thing we'll be talking about as well today. Right, Craig, over to you and your book, Excommunicated.
Thank you, Lindy. The one piece of context that I don't think Lindy mentioned there is that we're cousins. So we knew each other very well growing up, and Lindy came out of the Brethren about 6 months before me, and
I'm just going to dive in there. Everyone in the Brethren's related.
that's it's like what Laura was saying about the 2x2s earlier. There are
So
about,
you've got to be careful you don't marry your cousin.
yes, there are about 8,000 Brethren in New Zealand, and 70% of them were my biological relatives. And of those 8,000, 25% of them now come down from one couple who came here in the 1840s. So it is getting harder and harder to find people that aren't your relatives for the purposes of marriage. So yes, I came out about 6 months after Lindy, and watching her come out of the Brethren had a huge impact on my process of leaving. And I think that's part of what speaks to how this is so much more than just us. It's our families, and for Lindy and I it was our parents and our grandparents and our great-grandparents. We were 7th generation, so our great-great-great-great-grandparents were involved right at the beginning of the Exclusive Brethren 200 years ago. And the impact, there's a belief about the Brethren that they only went bad in about the 1960s, and I strongly disagree with that, because tracking back through the records and through our family's records, you can see that there was division and harm happening within the group long before the 1960s. So the earliest cases we found in our family were the 1850s, where there were splits between the Exclusive Brethren and the Open Brethren, and the family was living in the wrong place and was forced to move cities because they needed to be with the right people, not the opposers. And so bringing that context of, in our case, 200 years of history with the church and at least 170 years of splits and trauma, and the impact that that has across the generations, I think is a really important thing to acknowledge with some of these groups that have been here for a long time, because we bring so much more than just ourselves. And so how did the book come about? My story has always been out there. I came out of the Brethren in 2009, and 60 Minutes, a matter of weeks later, asked if I would share my story. And I said yes, and I had no concept of what that meant at that point. I'd never watched TV, so I didn't really know what going on TV meant. But it set a whole lot of things in motion, including becoming a journalist, because the 60 Minutes crew saw this kid straight out of a cult and said, "What do you want to do with your life?" And he said, "We think you should be a journalist." And so I did. And the 60 Minutes reporter who told my story also ended up becoming a parent figure, and she and her husband took me in and adopted me into their family, and so that really strongly influenced the course of my life. And so I can't separate my life outside of the Brethren from talking about it, because everything that has happened in my life since has come from that. And so I've talked about it quite a bit, and HarperCollins actually came to me and said, "Have you thought about writing a book?" And I said no. And they said, "Would you like to write a book?" And I said no. And I went out for coffee with the commissioning editor, who was trying to get me to write a book. And I said, well, telling one person's story in isolation doesn't capture the impact of a group like this. And just gave her a big lecture at a coffee shop in Ponsonby, and I told her about my parents and my grandparents and my great-grandparents, and this went on for an hour. And then she said, well, why don't you write a book about that? And here we are. And that, to me, I've always been super clear about the fact that this isn't just my story, it's our story. And I know there are some other former Brethren here today, and it's great to see them, and I hope there's parts of this book that speak to their experience as well, and beyond the Brethren too. I think there's what Rachel said in the talk just before this one. The names and the groups and the rules are sort of a little bit interchangeable. We all know what these groups are like. We've all experienced these things, and so for me it's more than just me, and I hope that comes through.
Yeah, I'll just dive in there. A personal comment about Craig. Another thing that really uniquely positioned Craig that made him really good for writing this book is that you must have been a bit of a nerdy teenager, or perhaps because you weren't allowed hobbies and TV and things in the Brethren, but he naturally showed an interest in like ancestry and genealogy as a teenager. And he began doing extensive research and collecting things, and it wasn't really encouraged in the Brethren to do that kind of thing, and quite a few older folks did have great grandparents journals and diaries and letters, that kind of thing, but it was sort of in the attic. But Craig, as a young teenager, was showing an interest and started digging these things out and getting copies of them and looking at family trees. And if I'm right, Craig, that was part of when you were like, because when you're in the Brethren, you've had all these people disappear, you've never been told about them, you don't know that you've got aunts and uncles and that sort of thing. But he was looking at the family trees and was like, who's this person? Who's that person? And then began asking, can I contact them? It's just for research on the family tree. And that was how he first began having contact with outsiders. But it meant that you're uniquely positioned, more so than most, to write an intergenerational memoir, because he already had and brought with him when he left the Brethren boxes and archives and records that he was then able to just pull together in this book. And I think that's a really unique gift, Craig, that so shout out. You could have definitely be a historian as a second career if you ever decided to change paths. So that's a unique gift that you brought as well. But yeah, so I think thank you for describing how the book came about and why the intergenerational aspect is so important. To move into a question about growing up in the Brethren. As a child growing up in the Brethren, there's a sweet photo of you on the front here, you know, sweet, smiling young guy. When did you first become aware of that there kind of this underbelly to your family history, to your family tree, a shadowy side to the Brethren? When did that first come to your mind?
The earliest memory I have, I was very young, probably only about 5 or 6, and whenever I misbehaved, people would say, it would be whispered, but they would say things like, isn't he just like George? And I didn't know who George was. And there was no explanation, and I wasn't supposed to be hearing about George, but I was supposedly like George. And it was whispered. And it took a long time, years actually, to fully become aware of who George was. And the other thing that had a big impact on us was my auntie pulled out these recordings. There was a lot of music in our family, and there were recordings of my grandma singing and playing the Hawaiian guitar, which she played for some time until she decided that it was interfering with her connection to God, and she stopped. But there were these recordings of her playing the Hawaiian guitar, and there was a man playing the piano and singing with her, and there was sort of this awkwardness with my mum and my auntie, and they said, look, we shouldn't really be listening to these recordings, but we're listening to them, and don't tell Grandma about it, because if she hears these recordings she'll cry. And it was this piecing together of figuring out that this man that was in these recordings with my grandma was the George that we kept hearing about, or that I was supposedly like. And it was this gradual realization as a young child that the reason my grandma was on her own was because my grandpa had been kicked out. Like, until that point it hadn't even occurred to me to ask why I didn't have a grandpa. Actually, both of my grandmas were on their own. Both my grandpas had been kicked out of the Brethren. And so there was this realization, quite young, that people had disappeared. And the older you got, and we're still talking like 7, 8, the older you got, the more you realized how many people had disappeared and how many people weren't being talked about. And it was both of my grandfathers, and it was my uncle and my auntie, my dad's 2 siblings, and my grandma's 2 brothers, and my grandfather's 3 siblings, and my grandmother's parents, and that grandmother's mother. And it was just this huge drain from our family of these people who were never talked about again. Yeah.
For those of you who are not familiar with what's sometimes called mandated shunning, or like strict excommunication, just a quick couple of points about it if you're not familiar with that. It often means, or it did mean in the Exclusive Brethren, a bit similar but a bit softer, I understand, in the JWs, but in the Exclusive Brethren it meant that you had to treat the person who's gone as if they're dead. generally speaking. There's some people who break the rules a bit and do try and get some contact, but it's also worse than dead, because as Craig's described, you are never to speak of them again, and things like all photographs in the house will be completely removed of them. And so if you're a child growing up and your grandfather was excommunicated, you would never hear about them ever, and never see a photo of them. Craig said that there were whisperings of, he's like George. One of my grandpas was kicked out long before I was born. I never heard his name. I couldn't have told you his name. I had no idea that he existed or who he was. So yeah, no photos, nothing. They're like obliterated. So yeah, that just might help explain if you're wondering how you can kind of know that there's not these family members. You genuinely don't know, because it's never ever spoken about.
Yeah, and it wasn't just that we stopped talking about them, it's that they disappeared entirely from the records. So the Brethren have very comprehensive address books and photo albums and so on. And after you were excommunicated or withdrawn from, as the Brethren called it, you were literally scrubbed from the record.
Yeah.
And so my dad's mother, for instance, my grandma, according to all the church records, she only had 4 children. And unless you knew the family, unless you'd grown up with the family, you'd have no idea that there were actually 2 more.
Yeah.
And the same thing, like for Lindy and I, after we left, and we see all the pictures and versions of the Brethren records since we've left, and we don't exist anymore.
Yeah. But if you've died, your birth and death date's listed, and your photos are still left there. But yeah.
Yeah. And so it means that unless you have any personal knowledge of the family, you have no knowledge that these people existed. And I'm still surprised when I meet people on the outside, or someone will message me on Facebook and they'll say, I'm so-and-so, I came out of the Brethren, I'm such and such's brother or sister. And I genuinely did not know that they had siblings. And so that kind of thing happened a lot. And I think we were all dealing with that trauma, because it wasn't just knowing the people who had gone, it was, as you got older, seeing people go. And you had all these people in your lives who you loved and you had these close relationships with, but at any moment, any one of them could disappear. And so I think living with that cognitive dissonance of having people say, I love you unconditionally, but overnight they might be gone, was a really traumatic way to come up in the church, wasn't it?
Yeah, I think, for the therapists in the room, digging into attachment theory and all that kind of thing, thinking about that, you're growing up in an environment that's deeply shaping you to have a very insecure attachment, because you know that at any time actually you could be disappeared and lose everybody. It really messes with you. Yeah. Okay, so Craig, I've got a question here. What impact did that intergenerational trauma have on your family? Do you feel that you've answered that just with those questions, or did you want to add anything to that?
I think to add to that, because we were talking about the impact of seeing people come out of a group like the Brethren, but there's also the mental health impacts that people are living with, and the trauma that different people are living with. So in our family, for instance, both of my parents had suddenly lost their fathers when they were teenagers, and my dad had spent, so my grandparents were out of the church for 4 years before my trying to get back into the church, because this was a common practice with the Brethren, was people would be excommunicated and then they would try to get back in, and they could leave you on the ropes for years while you tried to get back in, until they were convinced or believed that you were in the right spiritual place to come back in. But in the case of my grandparents, 4 years they spent trying to get back into the church, and during that time their kids were all taken off them and stayed in the church. And so it was, for my dad, it was 4 years of being shunted around different families in the church and not seeing his parents, and for my grandparents, 4 years of trying to get back into the church. And eventually my grandmother gave up and separated from my grandfather, because she realised that the only way she was going to get back into the church and see her kids was by cutting away from her husband. And the
So common.
yeah, and I think a lot of it came down not to spiritual worth, but I think, frankly, cruelty on the part of the church. So one of the big motivators for my grandmother in trying to come back to the church in 83 was that her oldest daughter was getting married and she wanted to be there for the wedding. And so she was doing everything she could to try and get back into the Brethren for her daughter's wedding. And the priest said, no, we don't think you're ready, you're not ready, you're not ready, you're not ready. In the end, my auntie got married from her uncle's house because neither of her parents were there. And the week after her wedding, the priest said, oh, actually, you're ready now, and brought her back in. And, you know, there was no reason for that other than showing that they had the power. And so you had these people. My dad had come from a broken family, as had my grandmother, and one of my dad's earliest experiences was seeing his grandparents thrown out of the church. And so then to lose your father on top of that, and then his brother, and then his sister, and then to marry someone else who had come from a broken family, there was just this trauma that ran through everything. And I think people in groups like the Brethren live with this pain, and people, you know, one of the questions is what do you do to work through that pain? And I think the experience in a group like the Exclusive Brethren is that you're not trying to work through the pain, like being in pain is the point. And that manifested itself in all sorts of ways in our family, particularly with mental health. And so my dad was, looking back, clinically depressed for my entire childhood, and that was a pretty terrible experience for us, but it wasn't recognised by the church. And if you were suffering, it was because you weren't close enough to God, which actually probably neatly takes us on. So I've got a couple of readings from the book where I might as well read what I've written rather than try and explain it to you. So there's a section from the book here talking about that period of my life, which I will read to you. When I was 16 and in year 12, Mum spent weeks in hospital after surgery to remove her gallbladder. She had been having issues with gallstones, and it all finally came to a head. I was struggling at school, acting out and talking back to the teachers, then driving to the hospital after class to pour my heart out to Mum. She lay pallid and grey in a surgical ward, yet still gave everything she could to make sure we were supported. Was she afraid of dying? No. If she was going to die, did she want us to call her Dad, George? No. I loved Mum dearly and couldn't wrap my head around how she expressed little affection for her dad, who at one point she had loved just as much as us kids loved her. My 6 siblings and I needed our own dad to step up and make sure we were okay, but as Mum lay in hospital, he spiralled even deeper into his depression. One awful morning he drove himself to exhaustion and collapsed again. This time he crumpled in the kitchen, cracking his head open on the bench as he fell. My brother Caleb found him lying on the floor in a pool of blood, and once again we had to call an ambulance for him. But this felt worse than his previous episodes. He'd never needed to be stitched up before, and now Mum wasn't there to pick up the pieces. Later that day, as Dad was treated at hospital, we heard that Mum was being rushed into emergency surgery again. There had been problems post-op, and her abdomen needed to be reopened immediately. The doctors said they couldn't guarantee she'd survive. I went through the day feeling numb, waiting for a phone call to let me know whether I still had a mum, and for that matter, a dad. What's a teenager supposed to do in a situation like that? How do you prepare for the possibility of becoming the eldest of 7 orphans? My teachers were as kind as they could be, but I couldn't properly open up to them about my trauma and grief because as Weldleys, I felt they wouldn't understand. When Mum came home from hospital, she was bedridden, too weak to do anything more than watch as Dad's mental health continued to deteriorate. He shut himself in his wardrobe for days at a time, obsessing over books of Brethren teachings as he cried in the dark for God to show him the way forward. Occasionally he'd emerge and shout at us for not being well behaved. One evening he became very upset about us not eating dinner together as a family. It was difficult to get 9 people showered, dressed and fed simultaneously before the 7:30 church service. He demanded we all arrive at the table at the same time. We made it happen, no mean feat, and sat there expectantly, awaiting for him to read the usual pre-dinner Bible verses. Instead, he stared at us blankly, then slammed the Bible down and shouted, "I can't do this!" As he stormed back to the wardrobe, the rest of us ate in stunned silence. I was in an impossible situation. According to Brethren doctrine, Dad was still the head of the house, and we had to respect his authority, even if he was no longer capable of exercising it. I couldn't understand where he was coming from or what he was trying to achieve. I was a headstrong teenager with issues of my own, years away from any empathy for the huge pain he lived with. I resented him for traumatising us and for his double standards. If I lashed out, the priests got called, but if Dad lashed out, we had to submit to his authority. Dad became suicidal and talked about wanting to end his life. I remember at least one occasion when he disappeared into the night and Mum was distraught. We had no idea where he was. Had he hung himself in the cemetery, drowned in the river, or jumped in front of a train? As the eldest son, I was supposed to shoulder responsibilities, so I took it upon myself to comb the streets of Invercargill, pushing aside a rising lump in my throat as I scanned parks and beaches for my father's body. I felt very alone on that late night mission. The severity of Dad's depression was brushed over by the brethren, and nobody offered to help me with the search. Finally, one Friday night at a local priest's house, it all got too much for me to shoulder on my own. He was a fatherly figure, more of a mentor than a priest, and I felt safe confiding in him. Our conversation moved to the privacy of his study, and I poured out my woes about how I was struggling to cope and that it was too much to handle as a 16-year-old. But instead of offering support, he told me to man up. You have a duty of care to your 6 younger siblings, and it's probably also time you took on a bit more responsibility in the family business. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I was barely holding my own life together, struggling with school and a nagging realisation that I wasn't attracted to girls. The civil union debate had brought home to me with awful clarity that anyone who might be gay would never be accepted by the brethren. It took everything I had to push my fears aside, and this priestly order seemed like too much to ask. How was I supposed to help care for 6 siblings when Mum was still very weak physically and Dad was incapacitated mentally? And what did I know about stepping into a tyre shop? But it was clear that I didn't have much choice. A few months later I left school and pulled on a pair of overalls. Local priests weren't the only brethren authorities telling me what to do. Around that time I formed a connection with a genial elder, Athol Green, on one of his visits to host special meetings in Invercargill. He offered support to many young brethren. He was also the father-in-law of our man of God, Bruce Hales Jr. During his visit, Athol ditched the usual custom of inviting prominent leaders to join him for dinner on the Saturday. Instead, a group of troublemaking teens was assembled to dine with him and Roger Kirkpatrick, a brethren doctor and senior leader who was also a relative of the man of God. This generous gesture stuck with me, and I kept in touch with Athol. He was always happy to take my calls, a reassuring grandfatherly figure. When I told Athol about what was happening with my parents, he backed the local priests. In an afternoon phone call from his home in Penrith, New South Wales, he said that because my grandfathers had been withdrawn from, neither of my parents had fathers. "You have to be the grandfather for your parents," he told me. My head was reeling as I sat on the edge of my bed, picking at the light green pattern on the covers. How was I supposed to parent my parents? I was only 16. Athol said he empathised with me. I had no dad, buddy, and promised he would stand behind me as I shouldered this immense responsibility. "Give it all you've got," he told me. "The Lord will honour you."
Yeah, thanks for sharing that snapshot, Craig, of some of the complexities and some of the responses from the church culturally, as well as from individuals around how to respond to family challenges and mental health challenges, and saw some of you nodding some of those similar things that are there in other groups as well, where scripture or faith or just the culture of the group is kind of weaponized against people. You know, you can handle this, the Lord will honour you, rather than actually just genuinely helping people who are really falling apart and really struggling. And there's so many stories like that. But we'll move on now. So what was it like connecting with family members on the outside and trying to build a new community?
Very strange. As anyone who's come out of these groups knows, when you start finding the people that have come before you and hearing the stories that they have to say, it can really shake your view of what your family is and who those people are. For years I'd been told that my grandpa George was evil, and the scripture that they use, I couldn't tell you where in the Bible it is, much like Laura, I'm no good at theology now, but smooth with the milky words of his mouth, but in his heart was war, was what they used to say about my grandpa. Even when he sounded all right, he was still evil. And so it was a real struggle for me calling people like my grandpa, because I still believed he was a bad person. And this was something that happened over and over again, uncles and aunts, and then I realised that there was a common thread to all of our experiences. And then I realised that the church was saying all these things about me now. And I was fortunate, we were fortunate that we were young enough that there were all of those older generations that had come out. And I've often said that in the first 2 years after I came out of the Brethren, I learnt and understood more about my family than I'd known in the 19 years that I'd spent inside the church, because there was an honesty and an openness about what our experiences had been and what they meant for us. And no lying, like goodness, there was a lot of lying in my early life, or convenient leaving out of the truth, and suddenly I was getting the unvarnished truth from all these relatives who had been excommunicated, and I'm sure you found the same.
Thank you, Craig. One last question and then we'll move to questions from you guys. You've still got, a huge number of family members on the inside, which is, it's an ongoing kind of challenge when you've left a high demand religious group and you've still got, half your people or a huge number of your family members on the inside. Do you want to share with us a little bit about what that's like? You've got a busy, full life, you've got friends in a new community, but what's it like when those situations happen, when your old life sort of pops up from the grave, as it were, and bops you on the head? Do you want to share us something about that?
Yes, so I think we'll go to another reading here, a shorter reading, which sums up what happens. And for me, this is part of demonstrating that you never get over it and you build a new life, and you think you've moved on or moved through to some extent, but it comes up and hits you when you're least expecting it. About 8 years had passed when I heard through the grapevine that Grandma Edith had cancer. Steeling myself, I called Mum and said I wanted to see Grandma one last time to say goodbye. Mum retorted, "She's not interested in seeing you." But I refused to believe that Grandma would say such a thing. I didn't blame her for not coming to the door on my visit to Invercargill. I was sure Dad had ordered her to stay inside. "If that's truly how she feels," I said to Mum, "put her on the phone and she can tell me so herself. Otherwise, I'm coming to see her whether you like it or not." I knew this kind of tactic was par for the course from the Brethren, but now that I'd spent a few years on the outside and seen how normal people interacted with their families, it seemed outrageous that my parents would try and prevent access to my dying grandmother. While Mum never put Grandma on the phone, she and Dad agreed to have a conversation with her. Eventually, Mum called me back with a compromise. Grandma would see me to say goodbye if I agreed to stay away from her funeral. She didn't want a repeat of the scenes that had unfolded at the funeral of her mother-in-law, my great-grandmother Rhoda Hoyle, when my excommunicated Uncle Snow got in a physical altercation with church members as he tried to reach his mother's graveside. I figured I wouldn't lose anything by agreeing to avoid the funeral. It was a long way from Auckland to Invercargill, and if I was going to make the trip, I'd rather see Grandma while she was alive. Besides, I didn't think I had the strength for a graveside confrontation with all those Invercargill Brethren. The memories were still too raw. My stomach was in knots when I finally made it to the hospice. This wasn't just about seeing Grandma, I was also about to see Mum for the first time since leaving Invercargill. When she met me in the car park, I noticed her hair was much greyer, but her voice hadn't changed. "Hello, Craig." There was no hug. I was an evil outsider. Just a brisk greeting, then I followed her through the front doors, wondering if she still loved me, but not daring to ask. So many unspoken questions. What's life been like for you since I left? Have you had any doubts about the Brethren, or are you still convinced that Bruce Hales has a direct phone line to heaven? Do you hate me for speaking out against the church? Are you curious about what my life is like now? Grandma, asleep in bed, looked frail, her wispy white hair tucked neatly away from her forehead, and Uncle and Aunt stood guard in the corner of the room. There was no hello. My arrival met with stony silence. They watched on as Mum gently woke Grandma. Craig's here to say goodbye. Grandma half stirred. There was a hazy moment of eye contact. Goodbye, Craig. And then she drifted off again. I kissed her on the forehead. The other family members didn't say a word as I quietly wept beside the bed. They didn't care how I felt. I was no longer brethren, therefore undeserving of their sympathy. Strangely though, although I was upset, the wrenching grief of that earlier farewell, the day Grandma and I sobbed in each other's arms, was gone. As I walked out of the hospice, I realised she had been dead to me for years.
Thank you, Craig, and many more stories like that are woven throughout his book, so do check it out. It's also available in most libraries across New Zealand as well. So we've got, I think, about 10 minutes now for questions, which is nice. So, yeah, have a wee think about what you might like to ask, and go ahead, Maria.
Yeah, I'm interested in, you were talking about two parents getting kicked out and the kids staying in without any parents.
Yes.
So who takes care of them? Like, where are they? Are they with grandparents or?
Yeah.
Like, how is that legal?
So it's that complicated situation where often the parents don't think they're going to be out of the church for a long time, and they're trying to follow all of the church teachings and do exactly what the church wants so that they can get back in as quickly as possible. And so in the vast majority of cases, the parents have consented to their children being taken away because they are still at that point trying to follow the church and they believe that it's the right thing to do. And then there have been cases where they've changed their minds and tried to get their kids back, and it's taken a long time to go through the courts.
So do they get like a foster family, or who's taking care of them?
It's definitely not registered or organised properly with social services or anything like that, which has caused issues because it's done very informally, but the children are sent off to live with other brethren families, relatives or others. So I experienced this. As an example, my sister got, so often it can happen if just one family member comes under church discipline. So I had a sister who tried to elope and failed, and she got under church discipline, which is not fully excommunication, it's called shutting up in the brethren. And so the rest of us, 5 of her siblings, mum and dad were shut up with her because they were under a cloud for not disciplining their daughter properly. But so the rest of us 5 siblings got farmed off out to live with others because our sister was in trouble. And so this also for a period we were living at home, but the whole family was shut up. And so even though we went to a brethren school, we couldn't eat with the other brethren children or talk with them because all social interaction is forbidden because you could influence people, even though it was just for an act my sister did. And then same, I was working for a brethren company, and again I couldn't eat with or talk with the other brethren. But so that was really hard on my siblings and me to be living this way. And so it's actually psychologically kind of easier if you choose to then go and live with your parents' consent to live with a brethren family. All of a sudden, now you're in a holy house. Now you can eat with the kids at school and you can talk with those you're employed with. So you're kind of between a rock and a hard place. So the children are forced to choose between going and living with others but having a semblance of your normal life. And just a reminder as well, we had church every single night of the week, 365 days a year type of thing. So when you're shut up, to suddenly not have that was incredibly isolating and lonely. So many of us chose that we'd rather go and live with other families to continue with some semblance of normal life, but it was informally done, and it has resulted over the years in a huge amount of I think some psychological and emotional harm. But it has also meant I'm sure with your background, awareness to being made vulnerable for predation from sexual abuse and things like that. That sort of thing definitely did happen as well. Yeah.
You talked before about your grandmother separated from her husband to be able to come back in. Do you think that that's partly what the Brethren do around having power and control over women?
Yeah, absolutely. So women who had chosen the church over their husband were a different status. They were called widows for the truth.
Celebrated.
Celebrated. And they had this sort of exalted status because they'd shown that their devotion to the church was higher than their devotion to the flesh or the marriage, and so I think that was, there was a part of that was intentional, because if you could split the family and have the wife and kids even more dependent on the church, there was a lot more dependence and a lot less freedom, and that, for both of my grandmothers, it locked them into a position of depending on the church to some extent financially and for support with their families, and which led to gratitude from them and them sort of pushing that gratitude onto their children because the church was saving them or protecting them from the parent that had left. And also for those widows for the truth that were left, like my dad's mum, for instance, her husband left and remarried outside of the church, but the ones that were left in the church, the widows for the truth, weren't allowed generally to remarry within the church, because they had to keep the faith that God might bring their husband or wife back. So my grandma was a widow for the truth, and even after they divorced, they keep wearing the wedding ring. And so my grandma spent more than 40 years wearing a wedding ring for someone that she'd divorced in the 80s, who had been married to a second wife for longer than had been married to her, but she still wasn't allowed to give up hope that one day he might come back. Elliot, isn't it?
You said that, you never really get over things, you just kind of live with them. Talking about, the siblings growing up without you and having to kind of watch that, I've not encountered other people until today who have had that same experience. How on earth do you cope a little bit with just kind of watching your family grow up and not being able to reach out to them? Because, I don't know.
It's a little bit of an academic question for us because we're so completely cut off from them that we don't for me, maybe every 4 or 5 years someone will leave the Brethren and have an updated photo of my family, and that's about all I know, really. But it's also really difficult to grieve the loss of siblings when they're still alive. And so for me, 8 years after I left, my brother left, and I'd made my peace with never seeing him again, and suddenly he was back in my life, and not just back in my life, but frankly behaving like a bit of a dick. And that's really complicated because you have these ideas in your head, like you've elevated the memories of them to make them out to be special, and then they're back, and it kind of crushes the reality of what a sibling relationship actually is. So it's complicated. And then you see people like my great auntie, for instance, who left when she was a teenager and never saw a lot of her siblings again, and then I leave, and the last memory she has in our family is of my grandpa as a teenager, and suddenly that teenager's grandchild is back in her life, and that really messes with people's heads. And the tragedy of it is that some families end up really splintered. So my dad has 4 siblings now that are out of the Brethren, and none of those 4 siblings talk to each other, because there's been too much hurt and pain in the family, and it brings up too much. And so I think that's a deeply personal choice. And like for my brother, he was angry at me for the pain I'd caused the family when I left, and I was angry at him because he had participated in the shunning of me. So I don't know. What I keep coming back to is that what you know of people in the group is not who they are, and to a certain extent you have to give them another go to show you who they are.
While they figure out who they are as well.
took a long time for my brother and I to get close again, but I could see that he was going through that process. And I think that's one of the most challenging things, is that you have to have an eye on who they'll be once they've gone through their process, because like nobody who comes out, like when you're fresh out, like you're not easy to be around. And my brother also made me realise how difficult I'd been to be around when I came out, which was really embarrassing.
One of the things about the exclusive brethren is the economic control as well, and I was wondering if you had any thoughts on that, and maybe like the infrastructure that keeps people within the religious as well.
Yeah, well, that's one of the issues, I think, is that it's getting harder and harder to disentangle yourself financially. Like, even when I left, I was a shareholder in a family business, and it created an awkward situation where the church couldn't excommunicate me while I was still a shareholder in the family business, because for so long as I was a shareholder, my parents were yoked to me, and so if they withdrew from me as a shareholder, then they would have had to have withdrawn from my parents, and they didn't want to do that. So there were these sort of quite complicated financial things that were going on, and that's happening with a lot of people who are leaving now. But the issue, if your job is tied up with it, and now we're seeing people whose homes are tied up with it, understand that the brethren are on a drive at the moment to look at bringing all of their mortgages in-house.
Yeah, sorry, just a quick comment. Again, if you're not aware that exclusive brethren, it's not all the groups are like this. Fascinating to hear the 2x2s, reject having entities, because the Plymouth Brethren are the complete opposite. They absolutely love their financial and legal entities. Loads of them have got charitable status, even though there's no public benefit obvious at all. And they've got their own private schooling system. And loads of people are encouraged to use their own administration services, own technology, like hire all your computers from them. Insurance, so as you've said, there's loads of financial entanglement, and it's increased hugely under the current leader, Bruce Hales. So in the last 10 to 15 years, which has actually been after we've left, lots of it skyrocketed, and they've actually got dozens of entities now. So it is really complicated to untangle yourself from all of those things.
I think there's no two ways about it. Leaving the brethren means you take a massive financial hit. Yeah. And that's what keeps a lot of people in there, I think, is that, if you come out, you've had no proper education, and you get put into a job that pays really well, but it pays really well because you're brethren, not because of your qualifications. Yeah. And if you come out, then you have to reset at your actual market value, which might be half of what they're paying you.
So just to clarify again, you're not allowed, when you're a brethren, you're not allowed to be employed outside of the church. So that's a huge difference again that makes the control much tighter. So, and again, you're not allowed to study university education on site and that kind of thing. So you've got to be employed by brethren, and they do often pay you a higher wage because you're not allowed hobbies, you're not allowed to spend your money elsewhere. Business is everything to them. So they often do pay you a higher wage because they're, in my opinion, trying to make the nest more comfortable, trying to make the cage a bit more golden, trying to give you a higher level of lifestyle in there.
Someone's got to pay for the private jets for the leaders.
Yeah.
Okay.
Would it be helpful to have a list of all these businesses?
Well, the difficult thing there is that the brethren are very good, I think, at hiding that they're brethren now. And so you look at their, they have a charity arm, the Rapid Relief Team, and the Universal Business Team is there, and all of these things that they, I think, hide behind. So a brethren business is never out there saying, hey, we're a brethren business. The most they would say, we're from a Christian background, or a bit like the 2x2s. And so there's
we're a loose bunch of Christians.
Has anyone successfully sued them, or are they in the redress scheme at all for sexual abuse?
They've been through the courts plenty of times, that's right. Personally, various bits of my journey have been through the courts at various points, but that was not instigated by me. Like the New South Wales Police laid charges over a stalking and car chase incident in Sydney, where they chased us all around the city for daring to film outside their main church. but that was the police that took that, not me, and the doctor who prescribed me drugs as part of their conversion therapy process. I laid a complaint, but then it was the health board that proceeded with that action. And my personal stance has been that it's better to keep talking about it and drawing attention to it rather than trying to go for legal redress. I think social redress to me is more important.
How about the redress scheme from the institutional?
Yeah. They were investigated as part of the Royal Commission of Inquiry, and many former members came forward, shared their stories, all that kind of thing. But as we saw again with the Jehovah's Witnesses, it seems to be huge resistance from the group to be analysed or held accountable. And I think they've been very successful, it appears, at wriggling out of being held accountable. For example, there's a whole lot of the faith-based groups that are listed, and it's required in the report that they must give an apology, including Gloriavale, even though the Plymouth Brethren Christian Church was extensively reviewed by them and is included in their report. Oh, hello, they're not on the list of being required to apologise. How on earth did they wriggle out of that? I have no idea. So yeah, a little bit like Rachel shared, a lot of us went into it with high hopes that it would bring about some change, and yet there's a sad reality that, oftentimes it is really hard to get any genuine change, redress, restitution, anything through legal or government spheres. So feeling a bit disappointed there actually, and don't have high hopes for it actually to bring about much change. But it's still really cool that some of it's in the report. Yeah, that's a win. Yeah, a couple more questions. Yep.
I think on that note, I'm curious, I think there was a little bit of media coverage a little while ago that the Brethren are quite involved in politics. And I'm just wondering, is that still the case? And to what level, and is it huge? Is it, yeah.
You're possibly referring to a story that I wrote, which was on the front page of the Sunday Star Times. I think the long and short of it is that yes, they're still involved, and the current Prime Minister, Christopher Luxon, is a big fan of the Brethren, and is involved with their business network, and spoke at one of their business conferences in 2016 when he was the CEO of Air New Zealand.
They were huge clients of Air New Zealand.
Yes, they're probably one of Air New Zealand's biggest corporate clients.
Yeah.
And when I put it to Christopher Luxon whether he regretted speaking for the Exclusive Brethren, he said he didn't, and he's remained in regular contact with the head of UBT, which is the Brethren Business Network, and that he also would not rule out speaking for them again as the Prime Minister. So I think there's a very close relationship there, based more on money and business than religion.
Yeah.
Need to keep repeating these questions. How do we weaken them? I think keep talking about them over and over. And I'm aware that the Brethren, officially, they haven't said a thing about my book. It's been radio silence, but I know what they're saying inside there because people keep messaging me and telling me. But the criticism is always very high level. It's you're attacking the church, you've betrayed the faith and all these things. And my response is that if we keep telling the truth, they actually can't defend themselves. And I say over and over, if you have a problem specifically with something that I've said, come to me and we'll talk about it. But until you can actually point to something I've said that's not true, your complaint is empty. And so I think those of us who have come from groups like this, if we keep talking about it and we keep telling the truth, these cults are in an indefensible position. They can't say that we're not telling the truth because we are. One more?
I just, on that note, you mentioned before about when you first came out and gave that 60 Minutes interview, was like you didn't really know what you were getting yourself into. So was there pushback from the Exclusive Brethren at the time, or if not, what was your experience in terms of what happened,
Well, I became persona non grata immediately, and then people were being excommunicated for having contact with me. So it shifted very, very quickly, which I knew would be the case. and I don't regret it. Yeah, thank you. So that's quite, yes. Did I meet my grandpa George? Yes, I did, and we became very close, and that's one of the central themes of the book. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Well, that was a really fascinating conversation, and I really enjoyed it actually when I was there in person, and listening to it again and watching it was fabulous. It covers so many really important issues around shunning.
It does, actually, and we're going to have an entire episode on it. So we'll wrap this one up now and invite all our listeners to join us for part 4 of the shunning episode. We'll not only look at Craig's interview that he's had with Lindy and pull out some of the threads of that discussion, but we'll also tie in what we've learned from Wendy and Savine and their contributions, and just talk a bit more generally about perhaps your own experiences in this area. So please join us for the next lot of episodes. It's always great to have you here on Cult Chat, and tune in. Thanks to Plains FM for working with us to get this podcast off the ground, and to all our listeners on other platforms. We'll catch you in the next episode. Bye-bye.
See ya.
If anything in today's episode was difficult or upsetting for you and you would like to talk to somebody, we encourage our New Zealand listeners to free call or text 1737 for support from a trained counsellor. Or you might like to visit the resources section of the Olive Leaf Network website, where you can find a range of organisations and resources that might be able to support you. We would also like to remind you that the views and thoughts and opinions that have been expressed in this program are the speakers alone, and Cult Chat does not necessarily endorse or share them.